Marcus Johnson stepped out of his car, feeling the familiar rush of anxiety ripple through him. The courthouse loomed ahead, its gray stone facade imposing against the bright morning sky. Today was not just another day at work. It was the beginning of a critical trial that could change the life of his client, a young man wrongfully accused of theft. Marcus adjusted his tie, a deep breath filling his lungs as he tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that had settled in his chest. As he crossed the parking lot, the sound of his polished shoes echoed like a metronome, marking the rhythm of his racing heart. He recalled the late nights spent poring over case files, strategizing with his mentor, Eleanor Hayes. He had the credentials, the passion, and the drive to fight for justice. Yet he couldn't ignore the undercurrent of prejudice that often accompanied him in the courtroom. Marcus had long been aware of the assumptions people made based solely on the color of his skin, and today felt no different. Upon entering the courthouse, he was greeted by the sterile, fluorescent lights and the scent of fresh paper and coffee mingling in the air. The hustle and bustle of attorneys and clients created a chaotic symphony, but Marcus felt like an outsider in this sea of activity. He approached the security checkpoint, where the guard barely glanced at him before waving him through. The slight sting of dismissal ignited a fire within him, and he clenched his jaw, reminding himself that he would not be defined by others' biases. As he walked down the corridor towards the courtroom, he spotted Eleanor seated at the back, her presence a source of comfort. Eleanor had been his mentor since he first entered the legal field, providing wisdom and support that Marcus cherished. Her silver hair framed a face that exuded experience and strength, and when their eyes met, she offered him a reassuring nod. "Remember, Marcus," she had said during their last meeting, "your voice matters. Don't let anyone silence you." He nodded, feeling slightly steadied by her words. The atmosphere shifted as he crossed the threshold into the courtroom, where the air felt heavier, charged with anticipation and unspoken judgments. Judge Thompson, a stern figure with a reputation for being tough, presided over the proceedings. Marcus had heard whispers about the judge's biases, but he was determined to rise above them. As the trial commenced, Marcus stood to present his opening statement, his palms slightly damp against the cool surface of the wooden podium. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I stand before you today to advocate for my client, who has been wrongfully accused of a crime he did not commit," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor of nerves beneath. But before he could continue, Judge Thompson interrupted him, his tone curt. "Mr. Johnson, let's hear from the opposing counsel first," the judge ordered, dismissing Marcus with a wave of his hand. The weight of the judge's words struck Marcus like a physical blow. He could almost feel the condescension radiating from the judge's gaze as he called on a well-established, white attorney, Mr. Collins, to take the floor. Marcus's heart sank, but he quickly regained his composure. He took a seat, pulling out a notepad to jot down key points from Collins's arguments. Each word from the opposing counsel felt like an obstacle, a reminder of the uphill battle he faced. As Collins spoke, Marcus caught Eleanor's eye again. She was listening intently, her expression one of fierce determination. He felt a surge of resolve wash over him. "Stay focused, Marcus," he whispered under his breath, jotting down notes furiously. "You've prepared for this." Despite the frustration boiling within him, he was committed to proving his worth as an advocate. The courtroom might be filled with biases and stereotypes, but he was determined to dismantle them piece by piece. As Collins concluded, Marcus looked up at the judge, the fire in his gaze unwavering. This was just the beginning, and he would not let prejudice dictate the outcome of this case. With renewed determination, he glanced back at Eleanor, who offered him an encouraging smile. In that moment, he knew he had to harness every ounce of his legal prowess. Today was about justice, and he was ready to fight for it. In the days leading up to the trial, Marcus Johnson immersed himself in research, sifting through case files and witness statements. His small office, cluttered with papers and legal books, mirrored the chaos in his mind. He needed to find something, anything, that would help him dismantle the prosecution's case against his client. As he flipped through the documents, he felt a surge of determination. The stakes were high, not just for his client, but for himself as well. "Marcus, have you looked at the security footage from the store?" Eleanor Hayes suggested during one of their late-night strategy sessions. Her voice held a steady calm that Marcus found reassuring amidst his swirling thoughts. "I haven't gotten to that yet," he admitted, rubbing his temples in frustration. "I've been focusing on witness testimonies, but maybe I should prioritize that footage. It could be pivotal." Eleanor nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. "Yes, and remember, confidence is key. Present yourself as the knowledgeable attorney you are. The jury needs to see that." Marcus appreciated Eleanor's mentorship more than he could express. She had been an anchor during this turbulent time, guiding him through the rough waters of prejudice and doubt. He felt a flicker of hope ignite within him, fueled by her unwavering faith in his abilities. On the first day of trial, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric with tension. Marcus stood at the front, his heart pounding as he prepared to deliver his opening statement. He glanced at his client, who sat at the defendant's table, anxiety etched across his face. Marcus wanted to reassure him, to say that everything would be all right, but he knew the battle ahead would be anything but easy. As the judge entered, the courtroom fell silent. Judge Thompson, with his stern demeanor and piercing gaze, took his seat. Marcus could feel the judge's scrutiny as he began to speak. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, projecting his voice with an air of authority. "Today, you will hear a case about..." Before he could finish, Judge Thompson interrupted him. "Mr. Johnson, let's keep this concise. The prosecution has a strong case. I hope you're prepared to address their arguments." Marcus clenched his fists, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, forcing himself to maintain composure. He exchanged a glance with Eleanor, who offered a subtle nod of encouragement. As the trial progressed, each time Marcus attempted to make his point, the judge seemed eager to cut him off, often redirecting the jury's focus back to the prosecution. It was as if he was determined to undermine Marcus at every turn. The jury's skeptical expressions weighed heavily on his mind, and he could feel the pressure mounting. "Stay focused, Marcus," he muttered to himself, taking deep breaths to calm his racing heart. He needed to regain control of the narrative, to show the jury that he was not just an inexperienced attorney, but a fierce advocate for justice. After a particularly heated exchange with the opposing counsel, Marcus decided it was time to pivot. He leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a moment to gather his thoughts. "What if I approach this differently?" he pondered aloud, glancing at Eleanor for guidance. "Think about the bigger picture," she replied, her voice steady. "Your client is innocent, and the truth needs to come out. Find a way to connect with the jury on a personal level." Taking her advice to heart, Marcus resolved to present the facts with a human touch. He would not let the judge's bias define him. He would rise above it. With renewed determination, he mentally rehearsed his strategy, preparing to challenge the prosecution's narrative head-on. "Tomorrow's a new day," he whispered to himself as he left the courtroom, the echo of the judge's dismissive remarks still ringing in his ears. "I'll show them who I truly am." That night, as he lay in bed, thoughts racing, he envisioned the jury leaning forward, captivated by his arguments, and the judge finally acknowledging his competence. It was a vision he clung to fiercely, a beacon of hope in the face of adversity. He would fight for his client, for himself, and for the justice that seemed so elusive in that moment. As Marcus Johnson stood before the jury, the weight of his role felt heavier than ever. He was determined to make a difference, to turn the tide of the courtroom atmosphere that had been so unfriendly. The security guard he had called as his first witness, a middle-aged man named George, shuffled nervously to the stand. George was a burly figure, his hands trembling slightly as he took the oath. Marcus could sense the skepticism lingering in the air, particularly from Judge Thompson, who seemed ready to dismiss George's testimony at the first opportunity. "Mr. Smith, please state your occupation for the court," Marcus prompted, projecting a calm authority in his voice. "I'm a security guard at the downtown mall," George replied, his voice cracking slightly. "And were you on duty the night of the alleged theft?" Marcus continued, leaning in slightly to convey sincerity. "Yes, I was. I was stationed near the entrance," George said, glancing at the jury, whose eyes were beginning to focus on him. "Can you tell us if you observed anything unusual during your shift that night?" Marcus asked, directing his gaze towards the jury, ensuring they felt included in the dialogue. George cleared his throat, his confidence visibly building. "I saw a young man leave the store just before the theft was reported. He didn't fit the description the police gave. I remember because I thought it was strange. He looked like he was in a hurry, but wasn't acting suspicious." Marcus's heart raced as he saw the jurors leaning forward, some even whispering to one another. This was the moment he had hoped for, the crack in the prosecution's narrative. "Did you see where this young man went?" he inquired, his voice steady. "He went towards a parking lot. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I remember this because I was supposed to keep an eye on the entrance," George responded, his tone gaining strength. "Thank you, Mr. Smith. No further questions," Marcus said, taking his seat with a sense of triumph, knowing he had planted the seeds of doubt in the jurors' minds. However, Judge Thompson, ever the skeptic, interjected. "Mr. Johnson, is this witness truly relevant? He was merely observing people entering and exiting. We need more concrete evidence," the judge stated, his tone dismissive. Marcus felt a surge of frustration, but reminded himself to remain composed. "Your Honor, if I may," he began, rising from his seat once more. "The witness's observations are crucial in establishing my client's alibi. If the jury believes that someone else was present and acting suspiciously, it could change their perception of the defendant's guilt." The judge's brow furrowed, but Marcus could see the jury's interest peaking. They were engaged, listening intently. "Very well. I'll allow it, but let's keep the focus sharp," Judge Thompson retorted, reluctantly allowing George to remain on the stand. As the proceedings continued, Marcus felt an unexpected surge of confidence. He turned to Eleanor, who was seated in the back of the courtroom, her expression one of quiet encouragement. It was her unwavering belief in him that fueled his determination. He could see her whispering to herself, nodding slightly, as if she were sending him silent affirmations. Later that afternoon, as Marcus prepared for the next phase of his strategy, he received a discreet note from Eleanor. He glanced down, reading her hastily scrawled words. "Missing surveillance video. Check the mall's security footage." His heart raced. This could be exactly what he needed to solidify his case. "Your Honor," Marcus called out, his voice resonating with urgency as he approached the judge's bench. "I'd like to request a brief recess to obtain crucial evidence that could significantly impact this case." Judge Thompson raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched on his face. "What kind of evidence?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. "Surveillance footage from the mall that might exonerate my client," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. The judge paused, weighing the request. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he finally nodded. "Very well. We'll take a 10-minute recess." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. He had to act quickly. As he hurried out of the courtroom, he caught Eleanor's eye. She smiled encouragingly, and he knew he had to make this opportunity count. With each step, he felt the weight of the prejudice in the room shift just a little, and for the first time that day, he believed that justice might truly prevail. As the courtroom settled into an uneasy silence, Marcus Johnson stood poised before the jury, his heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and determination. He had just secured the elusive surveillance footage that would potentially exonerate his client, and he knew this moment could change everything. The judge, however, looked on with a skeptical frown, as if daring Marcus to falter. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment, "I would like to present evidence that I believe will shed light on my client's whereabouts at the time of the alleged crime." He gestured to the large screen set up at the front of the courtroom, where the playback equipment was already prepared. "Let's see what you have, Mr. Johnson," Judge Thompson replied curtly, his tone laced with condescension. The judge's dismissive attitude only fueled Marcus's resolve. He knew that every eye in the room was on him, and he could feel the tension thickening in the air. With a nod to the court clerk, the video began to play. The grainy footage flickered to life, revealing a bustling street corner. As the camera panned, Marcus's client, a young man named David, came into view. He was clearly engaged in a conversation with a friend, laughing and animated, a stark contrast to the serious charges against him. Your Honor, as you can see, my client was not only miles away from the scene of the crime, but was also with a verified witness, Marcus pointed out, his voice growing stronger. This footage provides irrefutable proof that he could not have committed the theft. Gasps erupted from the gallery, and the murmurs grew louder as the jury leaned in, captivated by the revelation. Judge Thompson raised his gavel, attempting to restore order, but the energy in the room was electric. "Order! Order!" he barked, but Marcus seized the moment. He turned to the jury, his voice ringing with conviction. What this footage does is not only establish my client's innocence, but also highlights a larger issue: systemic bias that often leads to wrongful accusations against marginalized individuals. How many times have we seen innocent lives destroyed by assumptions based on race and background? The judge scowled but remained silent, allowing Marcus to continue. This case is not just about David. It's about every person who has been wrongfully accused, every individual who has faced prejudice in a system designed to protect them. We must ask ourselves, how can we stand idly by as justice is perverted by ignorance and bias? The jury exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from doubt to contemplation. Marcus could sense the tide turning in his favor. The seeds of doubt he had been planting in their minds throughout the trial were beginning to take root. Furthermore, he pressed on. The prosecution must answer why they chose not to investigate this evidence thoroughly. Why was it deemed inconsequential? Is it because it didn't fit the narrative they wanted to push? The lead prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Mr. Collins, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced at Judge Thompson, who cleared his throat but remained silent, perhaps realizing that the scales of justice were beginning to tip. Marcus took a deep breath, collecting his thoughts. We are not just fighting for David's freedom. We are fighting for truth in a system that has too often favored power over justice. I urge you to consider the implications of your verdict, not just for David, but for the integrity of our legal system. As he concluded his argument, the courtroom buzzed with hushed conversations. Marcus felt an exhilarating rush, a surge of confidence that he hadn't experienced throughout the trial. He had spoken not just as a lawyer, but as a voice for the voiceless, illuminating the dark corners of bias that often remained unexamined. Judge Thompson finally regained control of the courtroom. "Mr. Johnson, you've made your point," he said, a hint of reluctance in his tone. "But let's not forget the evidence presented by the prosecution." "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus replied, a slight smile playing on his lips as he prepared for the prosecution's inevitable scramble to respond. He could almost hear the wheels turning in their minds, knowing they had lost ground. As the prosecution began to mount their defense, Marcus stood resolutely, ready to counter their arguments. The weight of the moment was palpable, but he felt a renewed sense of hope. He knew that he was not just fighting for his client's freedom. He was challenging a system that needed reform. The battle was far from over, but Marcus was determined to see it through to the end. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension as Marcus Johnson prepared for his closing arguments. He stood tall, his heart pounding, aware of the countless eyes on him. The jury, a diverse group of individuals, seemed to hang on every word spoken in the trial thus far, but Marcus could sense the weight of skepticism still lingering in the air, particularly from Judge Thompson. He took a deep breath, centering himself to deliver a speech that would resonate with those who held his client's fate in their hands. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Marcus began, his voice steady but infused with emotion. "Today we stand at a crossroads, not just for my client, but for the very fabric of our justice system. We often speak of justice as a blindfolded figure, impartial and unwavering. Yet the truth is that biases can seep into every corner of our decisions if we are not vigilant." He glanced at Eleanor, who sat in the gallery, her expression one of encouragement. She had always taught him that passion coupled with reason could change hearts and minds. Marcus continued, his words gaining momentum. "We live in a society where assumptions can lead to devastating consequences. My client, an innocent man, has been wrongfully accused based solely on the color of his skin and the circumstances surrounding a crime he did not commit." The jury leaned forward, captivated. Marcus felt a surge of confidence as he spoke about the systemic issues that plague their legal system. It is our duty, as responsible citizens, to recognize these biases and to fight against them. This case is not just about the innocence of one man. It is about the integrity of our justice system. It is about ensuring that every individual, regardless of their background, receives fair treatment under the law. He paused, scanning the faces of the jurors. He could see the gears turning in their minds, the flicker of understanding lighting their expressions. I urge you to look beyond the superficial narratives and consider the evidence presented. The prosecution's case crumbled under scrutiny, revealing inconsistencies that cannot be ignored. You have the power to rectify this injustice. You have the power to restore faith in our system. Just as he was about to conclude, an unexpected interruption pierced the air. A man, disheveled and visibly anxious, stood up from the back of the courtroom. "Excuse me," he shouted, his voice trembling with urgency. "I have something to say." The courtroom fell silent as all eyes turned to the unexpected witness. Judge Thompson looked taken aback, but quickly regained his composure, glaring at the man. "You will sit down and wait for your turn," he commanded, but the man persisted. "No, you don't understand. I used to work with the prosecution," he blurted out, his hands shaking. "I was coerced into fabricating evidence against the defendant. I couldn't speak before, but I can't live with this lie anymore." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Marcus felt a rush of adrenaline, his heart racing at the implications of this revelation. The judge's brows furrowed as he processed the gravity of the situation. "Who are you?" he demanded, trying to regain control over the proceedings. "My name is David Reynolds," the man replied, his voice gaining strength. "I was an investigator on this case. They threatened my job, my livelihood, if I didn't play along with their narrative. But I can't be part of this injustice any longer." Marcus stepped forward, his mind racing. "Mr. Reynolds, can you tell us more about what you witnessed? What evidence did you fabricate?" David swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously. "I was told to manipulate the reports, to make it look like the defendant was at the scene when he wasn't. They said it would be easy, that no one would question it. But I know now that it was wrong." The judge's expression shifted from skepticism to concern, realizing the implications of this new testimony. Marcus seized the moment, his voice steady yet urgent. "Your Honor, this is critical and must be explored. This man's testimony could change everything. It reveals a conspiracy to undermine justice itself." The courtroom buzzed with a mix of disbelief and intrigue, the gravity of the situation settling in. Marcus could see Eleanor's eyes widen in surprise, but he quickly refocused on the task at hand. This was the breakthrough they needed. This was the moment where truth could finally shine through the layers of prejudice and bias that had clouded the case. "Mr. Reynolds," Marcus said, his voice firm yet compassionate, "you have taken a brave step today. It is never easy to confront the wrongs of our actions, especially when fear has held us down. But your truth is what will set us free. We owe it to my client and to ourselves to ensure that justice prevails." As the courtroom remained in stunned silence, Marcus felt a renewed sense of hope. The battle against prejudice was far from over, but with each revelation, they were one step closer to dismantling the walls built on assumptions and stereotypes. As the trial drew to a close, the atmosphere in the courtroom became increasingly tense. The air was thick with anticipation, and every eye was fixed on the jury as they filed into their seats. Marcus Johnson sat at the defense table, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at Eleanor Hayes, who sat beside him, her expression a mix of pride and concern. They had fought tooth and nail for justice, and now the moment of truth was upon them. "Do you think they understood?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the murmurs that filled the room. Eleanor leaned in closer, her eyes steady. "You did everything you could, Marcus. You presented the evidence clearly, and your closing argument was powerful. Trust in the jury's ability to see the truth." Just then, the jury foreman stood up, a piece of paper in hand. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Thompson, who had remained skeptical throughout the trial, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Madam Foreman," the judge prompted, Have you reached a verdict? The foreman cleared her throat. We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty. A wave of relief washed over Marcus, and he felt the corners of his mouth lift into a smile. The tension in the room dissipated as whispers of disbelief and relief rippled through the crowd. Eleanor squeezed his hand under the table, her eyes shining with pride. Not guilty, Marcus repeated under his breath, as if savoring the words. But before he could fully absorb the victory, a commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. The former colleague of the prosecution, a man named David, stepped forward, his face pale and haunted. I have something to say, David declared, his voice trembling. The attention shifted from Marcus and his client to David, who seemed to be battling his own demons. Judge Thompson frowned, clearly annoyed by the interruption. This is highly irregular. What are you doing? I was coerced, David blurted out, looking directly at the judge. I was forced to fabricate evidence against the defendant. I can't live with it anymore. Gasps filled the courtroom as the implications of David's confession sank in. Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the twist they had all hoped for. Eleanor's grip tightened on his hand, both of them recognizing the seismic shift occurring before their eyes. Mr. David, the judge said, his voice now tinged with urgency. You need to clarify what you mean by coerced. David took a deep breath, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. The prosecution threatened my career, my livelihood. They told me that if I didn't play along, I would lose everything. I had no choice. The courtroom erupted into chaos, the murmurs intensifying as people processed this shocking turn of events. Judge Thompson's expression shifted from annoyance to concern, as the reality of what was unfolding weighed heavily upon him. Order, he shouted, attempting to regain control. But the damage was done. The prosecution's credibility was crumbling alongside their case. As the judge called for order, Marcus exchanged a look with Eleanor. They both understood that this moment held the potential to change everything, not just for Marcus's client, but for the entire system. This was a victory not only in court, but also a challenge to the very biases that had plagued the trial. As the proceedings continued, it became clear that an investigation into prosecutorial misconduct was imminent. The atmosphere shifted from one of tension to one of hope as the reality of justice began to take shape. Marcus felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. This was not just about his client anymore. It was about standing up against a system that had failed too many. After the court adjourned, Marcus stood, his heart racing with triumph. The weight of the past few weeks lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a renewed sense of determination. He looked toward Eleanor, who was beaming with pride. You did it, Marcus, she said, her voice warm. You not only defended your client, but you also exposed the truth. Thank you for believing in me, he replied, gratitude flooding his voice. I couldn't have done this without your guidance. In the days that followed, as news of the case spread, Marcus received numerous offers from prestigious law firms eager to capitalize on his newfound fame. Yet, while the offers were tempting, Marcus knew where his heart truly lay. I want to keep fighting for those who don't have a voice, he told Eleanor one afternoon as they sat in her office, papers strewn about. This victory is just the beginning. I want to advocate for the underrepresented and ensure that what happened to my client doesn't happen again. Eleanor nodded, her eyes sparkling with admiration. That's the spirit, Marcus. You're not just a lawyer. You're a beacon of hope for so many. With that, Marcus stood tall, a symbol of resilience and hope. He had turned prejudice into a powerful lesson, not only for himself, but for everyone who had witnessed the trial. As he looked toward the future, he felt ready to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that he could make a difference in the world, one case at a time.